Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members, and for Senator Putnam, the language in the bill is on page 14 of the bill. And I've been reading up on the North Star Promise. I remember the discussion last year. But let's review what this is. And I don't know what type of promise it is for the taxpayers of Minnesota who have the money extracted from them every day, the hardworking taxpayers. But what we have instead here is an entitlement program that Senator Fate wrote into the bill last year, Mr. President. What this provides is if you are a student at a public higher ed institution in Minnesota and your parents earn less than $80,000 a year, Mr. President, you are given a free education by the hardworking taxpayers of Minnesota who may themselves already have paid off their student loans, Mr. President. And I really wonder if members here who voted for this last year really wonder what kind of salt that grinds into the wounds of the people of Minnesota that are trying to pay their bills and recover from this inflationary environment that we're in here right now. But the way this is written, and Senator Rarick's amendment brings this to light, Mr. President, it seems almost as if deliberately private schools have been left out of this discussion. As a matter of fact, and contrary to what Senator Putnam said earlier, this is not funding for higher education. This is money that goes directly on the behalf of students. This follows the student, if you will. And what was left out is all of those students that attend private schools throughout Minnesota. And Mr. President, I would ask if Senator Putnam would yield for a question.
Senator Putnam, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for yielding, Senator Putnam. So, Senator Putnam, you said you teach at a private school. Are your students that are at that private school, are they Minnesota students?
Senator Putnam.
Mr. President, Senator Jaskowski, can I ask you to clarify your question a little bit? Do you mean are they current residents of Minnesota, or are they from Minnesota? Do they stay in Minnesota? What do you mean by Minnesota students, if it's fair to ask?
Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. If Senator Putnam would yield again.
Senator Putnam will yield. Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, Senator Putnam, let me say it differently. If the students at your school attended a public school, would they suddenly become eligible for the North Star Promise money where they are not when they attend your school now?
Senator Putnam, to the question.
I'm sorry, Mr. President and Senator Jaskowski, I still don't fully understand the question. What I can say, however, is that some people have, I think, perverted this discussion in that the issue is about keeping Minnesota students in Minnesota. That's the primary motivation here behind the North Star Promise. It is not, in any sense, to take anything away from private schools so much as it is to keep students in the state of Minnesota. But again, I'm sorry, Senator Champion, I'm not being obtuse. I'm not entirely sure where my good friend Senator Jaskowski is going with this.
Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, Senator Putnam is having a hard time fielding a pretty simple question. Thank you, Senator Putnam. We have before us a bill that is attempted to be amended and corrected. If the policy of this body is to simply give away money in the form of, in the bill, it's called gift aid. Gift aid. And before this bill passed, I hadn't heard that term before. Maybe I haven't read every part of statute, Mr. President, but gift aid taken from hardworking taxpayers of Minnesota and given to somebody simply because they attend a public institution and their parents happen to earn less than $80,000 a year. It is just given to them. And we aren't going to, in here, the intent seems to be, speaking of intent, Senator Putnam, the intent appears to be to not give the money, the gift aid, to kids who happen to attend a private school. Mr. President, that's called discrimination. This bill blatantly, perfectly discriminates against private school students. And we have the majority here supporting the continuance of this discrimination when Senator Rarick, Mr. President, brings an amendment to fix it so that our policy is no longer discriminating against students who happen to be attending a public school. Mr. President, would Senator Fateh yield for a question?
Senator Fateh, will you yield for a question? Senator Fateh, will you yield for a question? He will yield for a question. Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for yielding, Senator Fateh. I don't know if you've been listening, Senator Fateh, but your North Star Promise legislation discriminates blatantly and perfectly against students who attend public school or private schools. Do you support that policy continuing to go forward?
Senator Fateh, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Jaskowski. I do believe that as a legislative body, we do have a higher obligation to support our public institutions and our public colleges and universities.
Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Another Democrat who has dodged the question that is before us, Mr. President. I could ask maybe more to yield. I might get the same dodge because this is a blatant discrimination against a portion of our student population here in the state of Minnesota. And Mr. President, members, when we go to vote on this, Mr. President, by the way, has a roll call been asked for on this?
Roll call has been requested and the roll call has been granted. And from time to time, members, that just brings up a good point. If you want to know if a roll call has ever been requested and granted, you can look on the board, and right there on the right side, on the bottom, we have our roll call. Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President, for that. I will read that. I've been busy reading the discrimination in our law that was written by the majority last year. And members, if indeed you would like to continue with this discriminatory policy that blatantly and perfectly discriminates against private school employees who may be very, 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 very similar to other students who are attending public schools, and very likely are, if you want to continue that discrimination, vote against this amendment. And I suspect that's what the majority is going to do because, Mr. President, it was written into the law last year that way, and that was the intention to begin with, to discriminate against students who attend private schools. And that, sadly, Mr. President, it is a very sad day in Minnesota when we see activity on the Senate floor that blatantly, the majority blatantly wants to continue discriminating against a segment of the student population here in the great state of Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Fateh.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't see it as discrimination. Actually, we have one of the most generous state grant programs, and we increased it last year. That benefits our private colleges, number one. Number two, would Senator Jaskowski yield for a question?
Senator Jaskowski, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Fateh.
Thank you, Mr. President, Senator Jaskowski. We've seen across the board increase in admissions, projected admissions, after seeing over a decade of declining enrollment over the up till this year. Minnesota State College Southeast is projected to have an increase of 10% after seeing a steady decline in enrollment. So are you against the program increasing the enrollment in your own district, Senator Jaskowski?
Senator Jaskowski, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Fateh. Well, Senator Fateh, as we see the woke majority here continuing to bring more and more socialist policies like yours that was written into law, it's now law, Mr. President. As we see more and more woke policies that institute socialism in this state, whether it's free education paid for by people who are out there working every day, or free food, or free cars, or free phones, or free anything, Mr. President, you're going to get more of it. And Senator Fateh, you know that, and I know that. When you give something to somebody for free, you're going to get more participation. That is obvious to every Minnesotan, and it should be obvious to every senator here today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other